There we go. Okay. So yeah, thanks again for hopping in on this one. Um,
You're welcome.
we'll just keep it, temporally weird because this is actually going to come out Monday. So the one we already did is it's the second episode, just to
Yeah,
keep it
where I
weird.
introduced myself to the podcast.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we could
First
we
time.
can. I'll probably mention it in the podcast proper just for funsies.
Yeah.
And actually, I was kind of glad to watch it again because
Hmm.
originally I was going to do this last week and I was sitting there like not quite remembering what happened. So I was like, oh geez, yeah, it's good to catch up on this one. Okay, I will go ahead and give it just a couple seconds, break to spot it in the audio file,
Sure.
and then I will start. Hello, welcome to Time Enough Podcast. It's where we pick apart all of the episodes of The Twilight Zone and beyond. This is Matt here. Joining me today, we were just talking, it's temporally confusing. It's his second time here, but it's the first time you're hearing him. Hello, John Arminio.
Hey, thanks for having me back for the first time.
Yeah, you get to do it like a double introduction. And of course, you do a fair amount of podcasting, so I should probably ask you to throw that up front again for the first time.
Sure. Yeah, I do a podcast called Popcorn Eschaton with my buddy Scott Thorough. He's also the co-host of the podcast Zebras in America, so you can find it in the Zebras in America feed. We tackle everything from the Last Temptation of Christ to the 36th Chamber of Shaolin, from a spiritual and or leftist perspective. And it's been a lot of fun because a lot of those are my favorite movies, and we have a good time talking about them.
I couldn't remember the word eschaton. What is that?
That is the study of the end times.
Oh, okay. That
So,
sounds like fun.
so if you're an eschatologist, you study the end of the world.
Ooh, okay. I have a few books on my Kindle about that I haven't. Maybe I've read one or two, but yeah,
Mm.
still a few. How the world will end. That always freaked me out as a kid. Like on my parents' bookshelf, there was a the day the sun dies, right? It's just
Yeah.
talking about how it like what happens in billions of years or whatever. But when I was 5 years old and I could already read, I'm like, the sun's gonna die. you know, I was like really
It seems that
concerned
Rod
about that.
Serling himself was fascinated by that very topic.
That is true. Not today's topic necessarily, although
Mhm.
it has some apocalypse sprinkled in, of course. So
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
one more pallbearer.
Mhm.
Uh, let me hit everyone up with a touch of the trivia. The original air date is January 12th, 1962. It's a Serling script, and regular director Lamont Johnson takes on that role again. Paul Radin was played by Joseph Wiseman, apparently referred to as the spookiest actor in the American theater. While he had a prolific career on television and screen, he is, of course, best known as the OG Bond villain, Julius No, in the first Bond film, Dr. No. Catherine Squire played Mrs. Langford. She showed up in many of those 1950s television playhouses, and she'll return to the zone in the episode In His Image. She also made film appearances, such as the cult classic Two Lane Blacktop, and her final appearance was in When Harry Met Sally. Trevor Bardette was Colonel Hawthorne. He appeared in many television roles, including spots on The Adventures of Superman and a recurring role on The Legend of Wyatt Earp. Finally, Reverend Hughes was played by Gage Clark. He did the Western rounds on television, showing up in those old standbys Gunsmoke and Maverick. All right, John, I am tossing you the prologue to
Okay.
read as thou wilt. If I copied it correctly. Dun, 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 dun. Let's try that again. Okay, tiny edit point there. While gonna edit this anyway, I will format it for you so it doesn't look wild. I just forgot to do
Sure.
it before we started.
No worries.
Okay, go ahead.
What you have just looked at takes place 300 feet underground, beneath the basement of a New York City skyscraper. It's owned and lived in by one Paul Radin. Mr. Raiden is rich, eccentric, and single-minded. How rich we can already perceive. How eccentric and single-minded we shall see in a moment, because all of you have just entered the Twilight Zone.
All right, thanks. Now the elephant in the room, of course, is in a season one episode that whose name is escaping me at the moment. But it's worth talking about Doctor No here. How deep is your bond?
Uh, Pretty deep. I've um speaking of podcasting, I talked about every single one of those movies on the Pink Smoke podcast with my friend John Cribbs. And we actually recently did a commentary for The Living Daylight. So I'm all up in Mr. James Bond and Joseph Wiseman.
Yeah, I mean, he just like you know well, I guess this guy is a supervillain in the episode. It's so,
Yeah.
small scale, you don't completely read it, but this is total Bond stuff. I got the
Yeah, he
Blu
has a secret underground lair.
Yeah, yeah. I got the Blu-rays, but for better or for worse, usually when I feel like watching a Bond movie, I'm like, Moonraker, which is probably the wrong choice, but I like
No,
Hugo Draxon weird
like
space.
for me, there is something very comforting about the Roger Moore era. Like all you could just like turn on those movies and feel good. Like a lot of them are really uneven. They're paced strangely. They got bad comedy, but they're all a fun watch.
Well, yeah, he rides a gondola up on the streets of Venice, which
Yeah.
is that's great. Yeah. So I don't know. Yeah, I guess Moonraker is like for me a better Austin Powers than Austin Powers is.
I see what you mean. Yeah, I can
Like
see
it's
that.
it's kind of crossed the veil because you watch the Craig ones and those are just like generally just pretty good, right?
Yeah.
Although I hate to admit it, but I mostly forgot what happened in the last one. Although I have only watched it once, so I'll have to get back to that. But yeah, I get Doctor No is also 62, isn't it? Sorry if I'm putting you on the spot
61.
there. 61.
61.
Okay, so he's
Yeah.
just following up with
Yeah.
this episode.
Yeah.
Okay.
With a very similar role.
Yeah. I mean, I guess he just has such a way with words, and Doctor No is being the first is a bit of an oddball Bond movie because it's been a little while since I watched it, but instead of the big brassy theme, it has like calypso, so that always throws
Yeah.
you off a little bit, that sort of thing.
Yeah, because John Barry wasn't on to score. No, he I can't I can never get it straight. The order of how John Barry came to score the movies, but oh no, he did score the movie, but it's the theme that he's not credited with scoring, even though he did arrange it. So there's that. And there's no vocal on the theme song like we would get with the next 20 some. So it is a little bit of an outlier, and especially because it's like the fifth Bond book, so you don't
Yeah,
really get a proper introduction to the character like you do in Casino Royale. um
exactly. I mean, there, the recent ones certainly found a nice vibe for that. So
yeah.
um but yeah, we do have the billionaire Raiden. I mean, that's right there, that's already like a Bond supervillain name. So
Yeah.
sometimes watching these Twilight Zones, we do get into a discussion of like what current things might have influenced the episodes. Like when we did the shelter, apparently in the summer of 61, like building your own bomb shelter actually was like a major national issue. That's when they started doing the fallout shelters in schools.
Yeah.
So I am wondering, I mean, obviously they got the guy, but I am wondering how much they were actually thinking of the James Bond supervillain when they did this episode.
And I think this episode would play better now, because I think insecure, narcissistic billionaires with over, like, out of bounds influence over the media, that's something we're dealing with now. Like you could easily see somebody like Elon Musk or who's the asshole that got booed at Boston University.
I'm not sure. There's Jeff Bezos. It's always fun to throw a few darts in that
Yeah.
direction.
Um like their ego is so outsized, coupled with crippling insecurity, that they will take a slight suffered on Twitter a decade ago and harbor that forever, and go to such ludicrous means to try and like get petty revenge on those people. And so I'm wondering, in the early 60s, when the specter of the apocalypse was the communist menace, Rod Serling was making the ultimate capitalist, the ultimate villain. And so I'm just wondering if this if the morals of this episode might have been lost in the 60s, but are very like bonk bonk on the head now.
Yeah, I'm watching this and thinking like I'm almost like watching like an analog Twitter with these three people from his past in the
Yeah.
room that he has, kind of a weird grudge at. Well, we'll get into the nature of the grudges a little bit more, but yeah, obviously Twitter and Elon Musk was, well, maybe not
Uh,
obviously, but that's
David
what was mostly
Zaslav was
going
the
through
guy
my
I was
mind.
thinking of. Warner Brothers CEO David Zaslav.
Oh, okay. I sorry, I was not going to pull that name out. So
Okay.
I have heard it before, but it's not in my recall bank.
Yeah.
Um,
One
but
of the billionaires that's not paying the WGA writers.
yeehaw. Yeah, I
Yeah.
guess that's still going on as we
Yep.
record this. But I guess, because we've watched Elon Musk by Twitter. We're watching him from the outside and just like being this guy doesn't, he doesn't seem to have all his marbles there in a certain kind of way, but it's distant, right? We're just like, oh, Twitter's weird.
Mm.
Whereas this is nice because we do get the thought patterns like, put into dialogue and things like that, because he does feel very justified in making this sort
Yeah.
of practical joke and just letting it out with these people. So
And it is strange that he doesn't have any enemies that he wants to get revenge on um more recently in his life. Like they're all from the most recent one is from World War II, 20 years ago. Um and I think the episode begins in a really interesting way that kind of like puts the viewer off balance, at least if they're familiar with the Twilight Zone, because normally if you're watching the Twilight Zone and you see an officer, especially like an older man, not remember putting a junior officer on court martial because that junior officer refused to lead what he saw as a senseless attack, and then that colonel says, I would have killed you. From the viewer's perspective, oh, that's going to be the bad guy. This is going to be the person who needs comeuppance because he's an asshole. He put his men at risk for his own personal glory. But then it soon becomes clear, no, that's not the case. This billionaire, obviously, is the person that Serling is really sinking his teeth into. So we're confronted with both authority figures and billionaires. He's a millionaire in the episode, but which are figures that Rod Serling likes to, you know, criticize. And so putting them all in this tight box, I think, is an interesting way to tell the story.
well, that's where I was saying I wanted to break down the grudges a little bit because I am thinking one, this is kind of an emotional, mind bleepery thing with these three people, right? Whereas maybe more recent enemies, he just, does a hostile corporate takeover sort of thing. He's
Yeah,
not
that's
like
possible.
he's maybe not emotionally invested because he's a titan of business, now facing other titans of business. So,
Mm-hmm.
but he's still just got something in his grill about these people from his more distant past. Uh, but yeah, like you're saying, the colonel almost comes across like a villain, and that's the one where I'm like, does that make this guy like? Does that redeem Raiden a little bit? I mean, I don't know. In 1962, is just like defying a order from your army superior for something you think is senseless. I mean, that feels like almost heroic now, you know?
Yeah, and it could easily have been heroic if Raiden was a more redeemable character, but I think by the end of especially once we get his character more, elucidated by the teacher and the reverend, he was probably in the wrong. It's probably his fault that those men died
Or
by
maybe it
not.
wasn't so much of a position of honor as a position of cowardice. I
Yes,
mean,
exactly. Yeah,
which
yeah, he acted with cowardice.
I mean, I'm a pretty pacifist guy. I'm not. I
Hmm.
mean, but I'm not going to lead the people in the first place in that situation. I feel like just I would stay out of that position in reality, you know. And I haven't been drafted. I haven't been through a war. I don't know how this works. So,
Yeah, Rod Serling
2023
was.
exactly. So, I don't. I mean, he was never like in command of people though. He did get pretty notably injured for the rest of his life, but
Yeah, yeah,
yeah, I'm sure he watched things like that happen, but that was the one where, yeah, Raiden is such a super villain. Of course, we're not going to come down his side on the end, but I was like, in this one aspect, the clock, the broken clock is right twice a day, right? So,
yeah.
the Reverend, I kept forgetting what the grudge basically was there because I was just like, yeah, it's the church, so of course he's got a grudge.
Yeah, and that's another institution that's ripe for being taken down. And so when those three people are presented, it's easy to believe that they sort of deserve what's coming to them. But then I guess it's revealed that Raiden drove a girl to suicide, but we don't get really the details of how that happened. I think that's pretty um weak in terms of the storytelling of the episode because it's just so vague as to how that happened. Whereas um, Mrs. Langsford gets to
Yeah,
monologue about
she's where the
how.
tires hit the asphalt with this guy,
Yeah,
basically, you know.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
she puts in relief because, yeah, like you're saying, it's a little too vague with the Reverend, the Colonel. You're like, are we sure that maybe he wasn't who's in the right in this? I don't know because they're both
Hmm.
horrible, so it's hard to say. But yeah, with his Mrs. Langford is definitely the main sounding board for this episode for Raiden. So
Yeah, and it's interesting that Raiden tells the Reverend, like, oh, it's just like you to give an overly wordy explanation when he's the one who talks the least in this episode.
it's like yeah, it's like the whole Butters thing on South Park. Butters, stop talking. I'm not talking. Some
Yeah,
people just
yeah.
get that thing in their direction. But yeah, Mrs. Langford. And I mean, I pretty even with the generational gap with the creation of these episodes and things. I'm like, but that was my high school English teacher, basically.
Mm.
I mean, she
Yeah.
didn't talk to me that way because I wasn't horrible towards her, but yeah, she just like I found a very naturalistic tone coming out of her where she's slightly confused, I mean, by the situation, not that, like I'm not calling her senile or anything like that, but yeah, she's slightly confused by this weird situation, but is able to relatively easily stand her moral ground and then walk out of her moral ground and take the elevator back up. So,
Yeah. And to me, it also showed Raiden's character that he keeps just calling her school marm, like as if that's her name, And of course, it's Mrs. Langford, so she's married. So it's not like she's, what, in the 50s and 60s, the absolute worst thing you could be in America was an unmarried woman.
the old maid, yes.
Yeah. Whoa, whoa, what a nightmare. Um, and of course, he was probably in high school 25 years earlier, so she would have been like in her mid 20s then, but he still calls her the school marm. What a psycho. So he just immediately belittling her and reducing any sort of beliefs or perspective she might have to beneath his notice, which is, just like a rich guy.
Yeah, just with the creation of this episode, one thing, especially watching it, having my third view last night for this podcast. I mean, the third
Mhm.
view in like a week, by the way, but uh, I really started to notice just how much detail there is in the script, because especially the Serling scripts, there are some kind of boilerplate ones that show up here and there where I'm like,
Yeah.
yeah, I just imagine he was like dictaphoning by his pool to do this episode. But this one just seems to have a lot of little wrinkles in the dialogue that, shine. I mean, that could be how the actor's delivering it as well. But I felt like there was a little more like time and attention on this particular script, which I could be wrong. That's just my guess. So
Yeah, yeah. When he says, when Raiden says, "Couldn't you have had some sympathy for me?" Because he's caught cheating, and and she reveals that not only was he caught cheating, but he tried to pin it on another student. And so she says, "Neither sympathy nor compassion can be handed out wholesale like cheap bubble gum. You are a devious, dishonest troublemaker, and in spite of all your millions, you are still devious and dishonest." Just turning that knife, Mrs. Langsford. Get him.
so uh what would you do in this situation? Let's think of how you slighted this guy. Um, maybe you were the person he tried to pin the cheating on in high school and didn't take the fall. You didn't take the fall for him, so you're in this bomb shelter now with him. Uh, what are you going to take the elevator up? Or are you going to hang out? You could sucker punch him and make it your shelter now, I guess, if you really think
I
that there
guess.
was
Yeah.
imminent.
I would not want to spend eternity with this psycho. I think I would take the elevator up.
Yeah,
Definitely.
yeah. I guess most people would. Um, of course, there's his whole deception as well. Like he's trying
Yep.
to be like, hey, the world's ending, so it's me or oblivion. So that does make the choice a little stronger, because
Hmm.
like I'm saying, like, I'm thinking here in complete feral ways, but I'm like, well, if the world is dead now, you probably could take out this guy and make it your bomb shelter. Who knows? Maybe it's got back rooms and it's like Blast from the Past with Brendan Fraser. That'd be cool.
Yeah. He's got 1,000 movies on 35 millimeter in a screen room.
Yeah.
All
So
sorts of food.
yeah, if it's a Blast from the Past Fallout shelter, that would change the story a little bit.
Yeah. He does have that cool monitor, which is high tech because it has like a ring of light bulbs around it.
That's cool. And what is it, like a mobile or something? Because there's like shadows keep changing on the wall because something's like moving like a mobile or a
Yeah,
chandelier or something. So that
yeah.
was
It's
kind of
like
cool cinematography.
a proto holodeck.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. But yeah, there is a certain thing. The shelters we've seen in the Twilight Zone. This one, I guess we could count Mr. Bemis's bank vault. The
Hmm.
shelter and the shelter. These are all just like the most rudimentary. Like, oh God, I would not want to be in there. Sort of shelters.
Yeah. Though I suppose if you're in New York City, the only way to avoid death is the most like sturdy physical structure imaginable. Like there'd be no room for any sort of accoutrements on this thing because New York would probably be the first place anybody would try to nuke. And I would guess I don't know if any structure, unless you're like 1,000 feet underground, would be able to safeguard you from a nuclear blast that direct.
Yeah. Oh, just I noticed I put in my notes. I called it a low rent holodeck. So I guess I need to agree with you
Yeah.
there. Well, high rent because it's New York. I don't know if you're 300 feet underground in New York City. Is the rent better down there?
I'm sure now they'll find a way to charge you $1,000 a square foot.
Is that where the Morlocks live? Yeah.
Yeah.
Something like that. Um, so it was kind of a quick turn where Raiden loses it. I guess
Hmm.
he just has a full on psychotic break. Kind of a weird twist there, but I do like how they use that bizarre sculpture as sort of the linchpin between his new I'm crazy reality and actual in this episode New York City.
Yeah.
So
The totem for his psychosis is corporate art. Love it.
oh yeah, the front of that building. Well, that yes, that it wasn't good corporate art, but the the facade behind it for Raiden Corporation was fantastic.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, yeah, of course, a supervillain lives in this building or works in this building or whatever. Mm.
But yeah, well, just like Elon Musk, after he took Twitter and people started leaving, he basically tied the remaining workers to their desk and said, like, if until the work gets done, nobody leaves. I'm bringing in sleeping bags. We're all going to sleep here and do our jobs. You know,
Yeah.
he's his his terrible management is making everybody's lives and jobs worse. And I can imagine Raiden not being much better.
Yeah, I know there's I mean, I haven't been there, so who knows? It could be propaganda. But I've read about, some Chinese factories like having nets around the building in case people want to jump.
Yeah, I have heard that too, but I can't recall if that was verified or not. But also, I mean, Amazon employees not being able to have bathroom breaks, so they're peeing in bottles on their shifts, like that's not any more cartoonishly evil.
Yeah, that's what would be reported in China, right? So
Yeah, yeah,
perspective is a hell of a thing in the end, isn't it?
yeah.
So, do you have any other big takes you want to throw out on this one? Just observations?
Um. Oh, I was really struck by when the Reverend says he'd rather die in the presence of someone he loves than spend the rest of his life alone. Um, Raiden like scoffs at him and like accuses him. You want to save your precious hide, your sanctified flesh. That's what preoccupies you at the moment. And he says the Reverend is being theatrical, more burlesque than legitimate. Like he can't conceive of another person connecting to human beings in a way profound enough that they'd love them and want to die with them rather than live alone. Like he's so separated from human relationships that he's gone off the deep end.
And that's an interesting projection as well, because like you said, the Reverend is like not being very theatrical at all. I mean, the acting's fine, but it's low key. Whereas,
Yeah,
Raiden is chewing up all the scenery in his fallout shelter. So,
yeah,
so, once you're calling someone too theatrical and sanctified flesh in the same sentence, it's like, wait a minute, wait, that's theatrical. So it's
yeah,
kind of a weird projection. I mean, that might be
yeah.
how he's gotten into this position, because clearly he
Mhm.
doesn't, like you said, he doesn't have the human relations. So things he maybe doesn't like about himself, he's just tossing off to whoever's around him.
Yeah, his projections reveal his own insecurities. Yeah.
So yeah, psychodrama city for sure in this episode. But
Mhm.
I mean,
And another Twilight Zone that's very much like a black box theater script. It's very few characters, one set, and just writing on Sterling's dialogue. It's really great.
yeah, I was very happy making the trivia because I didn't have to decide which actors to talk about and which ones not to
Yeah.
talk about. Because it's like, well, there's five on the screen. Not as good as Agnes Moorehead and the Invaders. That was
Oh
even
yeah, yeah,
easy.
yeah.
But yeah. But it's kind of nice to have like what was it, Catherine Squire, Mrs. Langford was, a playhouse player, so she
Yeah.
obviously did a ton of this sort of thing. And maybe that's why other than Joseph Wiseman, I would definitely say she's the one that acting wise is going toe to toe with him. The
Hmm.
other two kind of fade into the background a little bit. She becomes their leader just by force of personality of these weird summoned people.
Yeah, and Joseph Wiseman is such an interesting actor. Like he has such a striking face, very angular, um, just very stern and stoic, looking, but he's able to sort of explode in this outburst of emotions. And he has this sort of like British affectation to his voice, but he was born in Quebec.
I guess we
So
call that the mid-Atlantic accent.
yeah, yeah. So he doesn't talk like a real human, you know. he sounds like somebody doing the impression of a human, and so he's already just like putting you off balance just by looking to you and talking at you, which is why he's the perfect first Bond villain. And obviously, I think he's great here for the same reason.
Yeah, because when you watch him on screen, you are watching like basically him do his supervillain shtick again. But when once you've turned the episode off and you're finished with it, you think back and like, oh, there's a petulant child in that episode.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
that's how he comes across in the end.
yeah. And I love Mrs. Langsford says your whole life is made of illusions. Illusions are what people have done to you. Illusions about what justice is. Illusions about what is dignity of even the lowest of us. A fantasy, Mr. Raiden, and now you can have it all to yourself. Ooh,
Well, he does get the fantasy to himself.
yeah,
That's the twist, which I
yeah,
think this is one of the more twist episodes we've had recently. Because season one's every episode's a twist, right?
yeah.
Two mostly, but three has been getting out of like being quite as O. Henry like, I think.
Hmm.
Um, just looking around some episodes that surround this. Once Upon a Time doesn't really have a twist. Five Character Search is an exit has a major twist. Equality of Mercy basically gets the twist out in the first 5 minutes and then deals with it. Uh, Nothing in the Dark, not a major. I mean, I guess there's a twist, but it's kind of like obvious on purpose in that episode. I think that's the Robert Redford one we did last week.
Yeah.
So I mean, obviously, it's still a min, Midnight Sun has the twist, but that's like the last minute of the episode, and you could
Hmm.
actually go without it, and it would still be a pretty good episode. So, yeah, I'm just finding that the twists are less needed, but this one has a very necessary twist. I think if he doesn't end up in like the even worse version of Mr. Bemis's apocalypse, you know,
Yeah. Yeah. It's certainly a hell of his own making.
because you feel a little bad. Like when we did the episode, I'm like, yeah, I don't really like Mr. Bemis, but
Yeah.
but like but you feel bad for him even if you don't like him, you know. Whereas
Yeah.
this guy, you're just like, yeah, that's the correct prison for him, I guess,
Hmm.
because
Yeah. Who knows how many people he's ruined along the way to that, self-imposed Armageddon.
yeah, as a millionaire, I mean, he's he
Yeah.
might be responsible for a few more suicides, if not like direct deaths.
Yeah, and considering he's a media mogul, I'm sure this is a little bit of Serlane exercising his anger at the network. After the second season had the experiments with doing episodes on videotape, he was probably like, these network executives are gonna really feel it now.
Maybe that's why he put so much brain fuel into that dialogue. Is just
Yeah,
trying to Mrs. Langford being a bit of a proxy.
yeah.
So maybe that's why that character is so strong. That's Rod venting through her,
Hmm.
which is kind of cool.
Yeah, and especially in the first season, like proxies for Serling were usually like writers or ad executives, like upper middle class white guys. And so for him to have this very intelligent and dignified female teacher to be his proxy, I think is interesting.
Right. Here's a little thought experiment if this would improve or the episode have no effect or even make it worse. I would just, I recently did watch this in Kanigan for a podcast. And when I was watching this, I was wondering if we got just maybe a 30-second newsreel of Raiden, like just seeing what his
Mm,
public persona is, might make this episode stronger. Because, like, in Kane, we see this, this great man, and then spend the rest of the movie deconstructing him. So I was wondering if we just got a little taste of Raiden's actual public image, and then got to see him, lose it in his shelter. That
yeah.
I wonder if that would improve the episode. I don't know, or not. What's your thought on that?
Um, I think the format of these episodes of the Twilight Zone necessitates the least amount of information possible, just because they're just half hours. and so because we already don't have enough of the Reverend and his story, that I think even like 30 seconds excised from the episode might make it weaker. And so I think we get enough of him being an eccentric millionaire. So I think the opening narration is enough to give us his character and also his actions. But if this was an hour-long episode, I think I would go for that.
Yeah. I guess the season 4 thing would work that way, but yeah, it is nice. I mean, there's just so much media now just needs to explain everything, like
Mm-hmm.
the Star Wars prequel detail of we need to explain every single thing, or even Solo. It's like we have to explain where Han's dice came from. It's like, why?
Yeah.
I don't need to know that.
If I think that would be a fun gag if they didn't explain why his last name is Solo.
No one was asking for it.
Yeah, exactly. Because he's never by himself anyway. He's always with Chewbacca. So I like so in that case, I think that movie just overdid it. I think the dice thing could have been cute if it wasn't just overkill. But yeah, I like things being left up to the audience to figure out, and that's what I think is special about some of the best TV of this time. Obviously, like if you're watching Gunsmoke or Bonanza, they're not giving you intellectual puzzles to chew on, but that's what's special about the Twilight Zone.
Yeah, I mean, it's giving you a mystery box that is going to be fulfilled by the end of the episode. So
Yeah,
sometimes not in the most satisfying way, but you shouldn't have
yeah.
too many questions. So I still have a grudge. I think I've focused my grudge on Damon Limtoff, who seems to be the king of endlessly evolving puzzle boxes that never turn to anything. Because after Lost, people were like, it's JJ. So, JJ wasn't really involved after the first episode. And then
Hmm.
Prometheus came out, did the same thing. I was like, I'm going to blame it on Damon there.
Yeah. A lot of fascinating seeds with those stories that are never brought to fruition. God, both of those Alien sequels, I think, have like really interesting and cool parts, but they don't cohere in ways that I would like. I mean, Michael Fassbender, God, he's
He's
so
great.
brilliant. As
Prometheus in particular, I
wow,
would call that one of the best looking sci-fis ever. The sets
yeah,
and the designs, just and again, the acting's generally pretty good. It's just that obsession with you. We have to have a puzzle box. When in that
yeah,
case, people just want to see some aliens pop out of some stomachs and rip people apart or something. So
yeah, and
and
I think
flamethrowers.
especially with movies like Alien, there's no way if you're doing a sequel to Alien, there's no way to replicate what it was like in 1979 to see a chest burster come out of John Hurt for the first time. Like you cannot blow an audience's mind in the same franchise that way. And so I think it is to the filmmakers' credit that they're like reaching for new things, but I think they're wrong-headed. Well, let's just explain where the xenomorphs come from. Like that's not what we want.
Right, because the original Alien, you see the what is it Giger? Is that how you say his name? The
Yeah, yeah,
Giger
H.R.
designs and
Giger,
stuff.
yeah.
Yeah, you see
Yeah.
what we now say is the engineer ship. At the time, it was just like the really creepy alien ship.
Yeah.
Nothing is explained, but it's not really a puzzle box. It's just weird. It's alien, and
Yeah.
of course, it's not explained, and you
Because
don't
you
leave
don't know
that
what the
movies.
thing is. It looks like he would be 10 or 12 feet tall. Is it his body? Is it a suit? It's just this thing that's like off-putting and just, you know, an eldritch horror. And so the more you explore its origins, the less terrifying it is.
Yeah, and the frustration of Prometheus in particular, I think, is just that, like, oh, we need to explain this thing that you didn't think needed explaining anyway, and we're gonna
Yeah.
do it without explaining anything and like raising more questions, which is kind
Yeah.
of like them trying to have their cake and eat it too.
Yeah.
But
And like for me, for somebody who is a person of faith, for the horror to come from like human finds God, God finds human pathetic. Like that's a really interesting angle to take to find new ways to make Alien horrifying again. But it just never gets there, and that's frustrating.
Um, one thing when we did Prometheus, though, our guest for there, just to put that up a little bit, because one thing about that movie is while it's flawed, I find it, endlessly fascinating. And we had our guest on, like, kind of pushing that it's now that everyone is like, sure, Die Hard's a Christmas movie. He's sort of pushing for the Prometheus as a Christmas movie because it has. But well, if you listen to talking about the dates, it is Christmas time when that movie takes
Okay,
place. And
interesting.
we did the podcast 2 years ago. I'd have to listen to it again, but he had some relatively, at least, interesting points on how there's certain biblical things kind of like
Yeah,
baked into
yes,
that
yeah,
movie.
yeah,
So
for sure. Yeah, it's um there are way worse science fiction movies than Prometheus and Covenant. So way worse alien movies.
yeah. So yeah, I guess Prometheus is one of my biggest love hate movies. Just to end that
Yeah.
tangent, and just to throw out again that's my example, because an episode like this is a pretty perfect puzzle box. So
Yeah.
everything works out in the end. I mean, well, it doesn't work out in the end, but that's part of the whole comeuppance thing. So let's throw a few questions on this. Who in this episode goes into, travels through, is of the Twilight Zone? Where do these people stand?
Yeah, Raiden's deep in the Twilight Zone. He found a portal into it. There's
An elevator into it.
yeah, yeah, no worse destiny for this guy to show, like, through entering the Twilight Zone, he's being shown that his whole worldview is flawed and that he's nothing but a weak, insecure narcissist.
We have had a lot of guys just like falling apart and like kind of stumbling around in an alternate world this season. The Arrival had one of them. There's Death's Head revisited, with that guy
Mm-hmm.
very much deserving to end up in that fate. So yeah, it is the third one for a season where someone kind of has this kind of fate. The guy in The Arrival, you feel really bad for him because he, couldn't solve this crash and went nuts, whereas the other two people, Raiden is less reprehensible than, the SS concentration camp
Yeah.
commandant. So, I'm not gonna put Raiden on that level. I mean, again, we don't really know what Raiden's been up to in the corporate world, but
Yeah.
I'm gonna guess, yeah, he's not that guilty. What I kind of like is the setup here is Raiden is of the Twilight Zone, and the three people
Mm-hmm.
from his past are going to go through the Twilight Zone. But in the end, it's like, Raiden tried to set that up consciously, but the Twilight Zone does what it will in the end, right? So
Yeah.
it backfires. He ends up in there, and the other people, their Twilight Zone is coming out of that elevator and being like, "Oh, everything's fine." Well, that guy really was a prick.
Yeah.
They're gonna
Yeah,
feel
I
smart.
it would have been interesting to see their different reactions to the world being just normal and just being like, oh, of course this guy was a liar. That's his whole deal.
So they got a fun Twilight Zone, which we did not. Again, in the 45-minute, and I'm saying that because that's how long the hour episodes actually run, right? In the hour-long episode, you'd get that, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
That is the flaw, though. You add that little my newsreel idea. Maybe we'll add that. We'll have the reaction shots at the end. We've now got a 35-minute episode, which means there's 10 minutes missing, which is why some of the season 4 ones drag a little bit.
Yeah. You see that definitely in like Outer Limits and even Star Trek, where it's like a 35, 40-minute idea stretched to 50 minutes.
I guess that is one plus to modern television, is you get to make your episode as long as you want to if it's streaming.
Mm-hmm.
So uh
Although we have seen a lot of series where a 45-minute episode is stretched to 60 and just like,
yeah,
whoa, get this thing over with.
or there's the 45-minute episode that you actually don't need in the 10 episode run or something.
Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah.
that certainly, so I don't know, I guess it's kind of a double-edged sword on that one.
Mm-hmm.
um I guess we're gonna put Raiden as the guy who just went in the Twilight Zone. Does he deserve his trip into the Twilight Zone?
Oh yeah, absolutely. This is a guy who spends his days inventing cruel practical jokes to get at people who humiliated him in his past in ways that he deserved anyway. Um, he's a bitter, self-absorbed narcissist. He deserves everything he gets.
Yeah, I felt a little stupid actually asking the question this
Yeah.
week. Um, how about his three potential victims? Do they deserve this experience? Are they? Is this actually going to make them better or smarter, or is the Colonel just going to get his own Twilight Zone maybe next week because he didn't seem
Um,
that great?
yeah, I could definitely see the Colonel becoming worse, like his just ego being blown up and being and thinking that, well, of course, every decision I made as a military authority figure is right and correct. Um, but I think the moral compasses of Mrs. Langford and the Reverend are probably strengthened, and they're probably going to appreciate their families all the more after this experience.
Yeah. So maybe Colonel Hawthorne did not deserve his trip into the Twilight Zone because it has the potential to make him more insufferable. Okay.
Yeah, yeah, he'll deserve it in the fourth season.
Right. Uh let's put this one on the tripometer, 0 being not trippy at all, 5 being very trippy.
I think for Raiden, it's a 4 because his mind gets blown. Um, but it's not a 5 because it's through means of his own devising. But for the other characters, I would say it's like a 2 because it's just a rich guy being a jerk, which happens a lot.
I don't know. I was going to give this episode a 4 as well, and with
Okay.
Raiden being the main reason. Uh, but now I'm thinking I've never split the tripometers with thinking about the other people being a 2. I would bump them up to at least a 3 because they got this weird random like invite slash demand that they come to
Yeah.
this bizarre shelter deep under New York City. It looks like
Yeah,
you're
the
going
hour
into the
version
van from Uncle.
yeah, the hour version would have to explain why they accepted the invitation from this guy they hated.
Yeah, I guess it was. Well, was the colonel said he told me it was life and death or something, or maybe that was the reverend. Anyway, obviously it
Yeah.
was not just like, will you visit this guy, but this is a matter of life and death, right? So,
Yeah. But
uh,
yeah, so a weird elaborate lie to just get them there in the first place.
yep, yeah, okay, but yeah, I guess just all in all, because of just the end apocalyptic view, which that always trips me out a little bit. The bomb
Hmm.
shelter itself definitely tripped me out because the one the shelter doesn't. That one's relatively boring. Where this one's fantastic. It does
Yeah.
start to have the trappings of a proper bond layer. So I think that kind of design thing will bump it up for me just a touch. Again, the facade of the Raiden building is just so mid-century that I'm like,
Yeah.
yeah, that brings me in a lot. Hey, do you have a final thought on this episode?
Um, do I? Sorry.
You don't really have to. It was
Uh,
yeah.
oh, I was fascinated that the Reverend said that, you know, like life comes at a great cost, but the price of honor is even higher. Which is an interesting thing for a reverend to say that there's things more important than one's own life. Um, so I guess we can get into like the thoughts of like, did this reverend think he was gonna be a martyr to his own morality or something like that? But it was just a very strong statement from the spiritual leader in this episode that one's time on this mortal plane, it's not the end all and be all of existence. So I found that a pretty powerful ending statement.
Yeah, I guess when this was made, having a reverend is shorthand for this person believes that things will go on after death.
Yeah.
Now you would be like, is that just his job, or is he actually believe or not?
Mhm.
We'd have to suss that out now. So
Yeah. Yeah. Um there's been a real run in modern horror of like anybody who believes in God is a real psychopath. Um, Whereas in a movie like The Exorcist, they're very flawed individuals, but you take them and their mission seriously. So yeah, it just depends on how that character is written and how it's performed.
yeah, and then yeah, I guess that doesn't involve so much with the other two, but let's wrap this one up then. Oh man, I'm trying to remember. I still am working on this podcast name. It's Popcorn, and then it's Epis. I Epis.
Popcorn Eschaton.
Okay, words I
Yeah.
gotta learn. So yeah, dig that for some multimedia spirituality benders. Uh
So yeah, the episode we just released was on the 36th Chamber of Shaolin. I had my friend Trevor on. And so Scott, Trevor, and I discussed like self-actualization and how film can help one's own like mental health because my friend Trevor has had some troubles in the past, and so we go into how 36 Chamber like helped him through that. So it was a real fascinating discussion.
all right. As for this, it is Time Enough Podcast. We're that on Twitter. We're that on Facebook. On Patreon, we're part of the Podcastius umbrella, where we also talk about supposedly really good movies, and supposedly really bad movies on Films and Filth. I talk about Disney on the Occult Disney, and there's some gamer pods like Luke Loves Pokemon, Hyrule Field Report about Zelda, and the Game Show with gamers gaming each other. Okay, I think I got that all out. So yeah, you know my favorite Twilight Zone elevator, maybe. That's a question.
Oh, I don't.
Oh, okay. That's a Tower of Terror. I was surprised
Oh,
Rod.
okay,
I
sure,
just
sure.
surprised Rod wanted to get in that elevator in this episode, but I don't have to get in any elevators today, so I'm good.
Okay.
Trying to think when the last time I've been in an elevator is. Huh, it's been a while. Let me stop that recording.